Welcome back. My name is Martin Becher, and today we will talk about entry points for adaptation in sustainable infrastructure investments. Let's start talking about entry points for adaptation and windows of opportunity. So, what are windows of opportunity? Windows of opportunity are situations or processes that help to gain the interest of policymakers, important stakeholders, or the broader public in order to help us to mainstream climate change into infrastructure investments. So these are moments where important stakeholders get sensitized for this important subject matter. And these are moments we need to take advantage of in order to start the process of mainstreaming. So these could, for instance, be situations like extreme weather events where everybody is sensitized for the topic, conflicts arising around certain situations, positions, interests, and needs of decision makers in order to move forward something. And in these moments, when we notice that the topic of mainstreaming climate adaptation into public infrastructure investment is hot, that's the moment we try to grab in order to use this window of opportunity in order to bring our important topic into the process. Classical entry points for adaptation mainstreaming in the national context is, for instance, the National Adaptation Plan or the so-called NDCs, National Determined Contributions, which usually do tackle different sectors. And one of the sectors which is classically tackled is infrastructure. And both the SNAP and NDC usually also don't work on the national level only, but also on the subnational level. So we can look into different subchapters of these strategies in order to incorporate our adaptation mainstreaming topics into development strategies, investment plans, and others. And also, when we talk about project level, adaptation can be considered in each step of the infrastructure investment process, which usually starts with the step of sector policy plans and regulations, meaning all legal points that frame our process. So policies, infrastructure planning, and regulation codes, all these are entry points where we can try to include climate adaptation in order to make our infrastructure investments climate proof. Usually we start our projects then with project identification, and there it is quite important and relevant to consider climate change in the project framing and project specific site selection, framed into feasibility studies, in order to ensure that the site we are selecting is, for instance, not too much exposed. Once we have finished project identification, we continue with project preparation, meaning the whole design process. And here we should consider climate change in the feasibility studies and detailed design of a project. So if we know, for instance, that floods in the future will be stronger than they are currently, we can already design our infrastructure project in a way that it withstands future floods. When it comes to resource mobilization, meaning usually money, a classical point to take into consideration is, on the one hand side, on costings, meaning future costs due to climate change, and also insurance schemes. When we notice or know that risks in the future might be quite considerable, it might make sense to already take into consideration insurances for our resource mobilization. Finally, we start construction. And here it is also important to take climate change into consideration. during the whole operational procedure of dam construction, for instance. And last but not least, once our infrastructure is in place, we need also to take climate change into consideration in operational procedures and maintenance schemes in order to ensure that our infrastructure will be functioning, although climate will be changing over time. And all this can be done by applying different steps, the so-called climate proofing steps, in all these different steps that I just mentioned. The first one is scoping, where we make a quick assessment whether climate change is a relevant topic at all or not. If we do assess it is a relevant topic, we have to perform a risk assessment in order to see which underlying reasons we have that make our project suffer from climate risk, meaning which hazards it is or might be exposed to, the exposure itself, the vulnerability, this leading to impact and then consequently to risk. Once we know the underlying reasons for risk, we proceed to formulate risk treatment measures, meaning what can we do in order to reduce risk. And finally, we also need to take into consideration monitoring and evaluation in order to assess if the risks are really dropping or not, and to learn for the future. There are three main enabling factors for climate proofing. The first one relates to institutional arrangements, meaning mechanisms in place for ongoing dialogue between actors at different levels, meaning having relevant, preferably multi-stakeholder platforms to facilitate dialogue and training, and to have mainly two kinds of experts. On the one hand side, infrastructure investment experts and also climate service experts, and bring these experts together in order to discuss which are the best arrangements to climate proof my infrastructure investment. Second, quite important factor is information sharing. Information usually is shared everywhere and spread by different stakeholders and institutions. And this information can be related both to climate services as well as to infrastructure, and both at national, regional, or local level. And for this reason, it is quite important to have ways and platforms in place in order to enable everyone to share information and to get access to different information and climate services in order to really know how climate change will impact us in the future and to climate proof our infrastructure. Finally, it is about capacity development, because we can have excellent institutional arrangements and information sharing in place, but if we do not know what to do with it and how to use this information in order to climate proof our infrastructure, everything only makes limited sense. So we really need to think about good and operational capacity development measures that enable us to reduce our climate risk in the future. Last but not least, let's have a look into classical entry points for adaptation. One are national or regional policies on infrastructure. These could be national or regional policies for ports, roads, etc., and also development that are currently being reviewed or being elaborated and might benefit from considering climate change. So if you are already within a process of reviewing or elaborating, that's the moment to try to mainstream climate change into these sectors. As already said, the National Adaptation Plan and different subsector chapters are relevant as well in order to enable us to take action. What is key is usually money. So infrastructure related budget plans are also key if we succeed to mainstream climate change into budget. So there are different countries or regions where budgets for infrastructure need to take climate change into account in order to reduce the investment risk, for instance. Also, when we talk about building codes, as here, it is relevant to take climate change into account because building codes usually are formulated for the climate that was in the past, but it should also take into account the climate of the future, as infrastructure usually is there to stay here for a couple of decades. And last but not least, when we are working on infrastructure investment projects, which are currently being planned or reviewed, this is also the chance to integrate climate risk considerations into planning or refurbishment. This is it from my side. Thank you so much and looking forward to our next session. Goodbye.